So to kick off our first session today, he doesn't need that much of an introduction. If you know Christian Brand, he's a senior product manager at Google. Christian is a leading contributor to FIDO. He heads up our FIDO 2 working group and is a major contributor to our specifications and really drives implementation of FIDO within Google. So he's here today to talk about what's next with FIDO and what Google has planned for the future. Christian.
Thank you so much. Good morning, folks. Can you all hear me? Yeah, that sounds good. Can I put my coffee up here? Will that look distracting? Anyway, we'll see. Thanks for joining me at the crack of dawn. It feels like you're in Seattle. It was still dark out at 8. I know what's going on. Thanks for coming to listen to what I have to say this morning. I'm going to be focusing a little bit more, I guess, on FIDO in the general sense, a little bit more on that than on specific kind of Google implementation. Today, a little bit later, as far as I remember, there's going to be a panel. On the panel, I think, I'll talk a little bit more about kind of like Google plans and things like that. But this session is mainly going to be about what's happening in FIDO, what has happened, how far have we come, and what are the things that we're still battling with today, and the things that we need to try and address. The presentation is, I guess, a little bit more on the technical side, perhaps. There's a little code snippets and things in there. If you are new to FIDO, I think you'll be able to follow along just fine. There might be some things here and there that you might want to reference later or kind of like look at again. And also feel free to ask questions later on. But I'll just want to say that if there are some things that you kind of like don't immediately grasp, don't worry. Like the deck is kind of like, it doesn't really build on top of each other. We're going to talk about 3 distinct things, and at any point in time, like we'll kind of start afresh with a new one. So shouldn't get too lost. So first and foremost, let's start with why we are doing what we're doing, right? Why FIDO, and why are we even here, right? This is some data that I pulled from the Google Safe Browsing, the Google Transparency Report. We stopped splitting out malware versus phishing like about a year ago. I think, malware just went to almost 0, and phishing is the primary vector, so we don't even split it out any longer. It's really interesting to kind of see that change around about 2015. No one really knows why exactly, but I guess malware has become harder and harder to perpetuate. Like platforms are hardened, like Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10. Microsoft platform is still predominantly also what we see as the primary platform that users are logging in from. And with Mac and all the other kind of operating systems that has protections built in, much better protections than we've seen in consumer operating systems in the past, malware has become hard, and phishing has, I guess, I don't even know, become easier. It's always been easy, but I guess now with phishing kits and kind of like the whole economy out there, phishing is rife, right? That is the number one thing that we think we need to try and protect users against, and it's kind of like spiraling out of control a little bit. And as we've seen earlier in presentations that other folks have given here at the FIDO conference, too. One of the key issues that we're seeing is that traditional forms of multi-factor authentication don't really address the phishing challenge, right? That is one of the key things that we know. I'll just note one thing. My timer isn't working, so I'll keep manual time here. Let me just reset. I don't want to run out of time. I usually end up doing that, so I'll just make sure that I remember. All right, let's start. Introducing WebAuthn. This is what we have, I guess, dreamt up here collectively at FIDO and at the W3C to try and address this phishing problem. Well, how does this work and how do things hang together? I'm sure you're all familiar with this by now. But in essence, there is a number of components in FIDO 2. There is, of course, a remote server. If you're an application developer, that's where you will work. That's where the authentication would normally happen. That's where you'd serve your authentication pages from. There is something called a client. Typically, that's where the user is coming in from. So that might be the browser, phone, laptop, typically. And then there's a number of different types of authenticators in FIDO 2. There is removable authenticators, which we've heard a lot of folks talk about. Bob Lord in the keynote. And other folks here, this is kind of like the first instantiation of FIDO, was get a physical removable security key. It's easy to use, you plug it in, it's easy to deploy, it's easy to augment your current system with it. You just buy the key and plug it in, and suddenly you are FIDO enabled, right? So when you log in, you can benefit from some of the protections that FIDO has to offer, like the unique phishing resistance. Something else that's become a lot more interesting these days is also the built-in authenticators in platforms. And I think that is where we'll see the real scale of FIDO. You have a physical, fingerprint sensor or maybe a facial recognition sensor, or it doesn't even have to be biometric at all. Authenticator built into a platform could simply be you typing a 4-digit PIN code to unlock the authenticator. That's perfectly valid in terms of FIDO, and that's basically something that comes with the device that you own. Now, there's two protocols here. If you're a remote server developer or an application developer, the W3C protocol is the one that you'll be most interested in. That's the one that you will be using in order to use FIDO, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then there's another protocol in FIDO called CTAP, the Client to Authenticator protocol. That is more interesting if you are an authenticator developer, right? If you are making USB or NFC or maybe even Bluetooth keys, that's where a lot of that work would happen. So typically, if you're interested in implementing FIDO on a website, CTAP, not that important. The WebAuthn protocol is kind of where you should focus. You might also think that, like, hey, maybe CTAP is complete, like we have all the protocols we need. As we'll see later in the deck, we are working on some folks have called me this week and said, you've been working on it for the last 5 years. But yeah, we're working on it. And tomorrow and on Friday, if you're going to be part of the plenary, there will be a lot more discussions about that too. But essentially, that is where we are working to try and bring the phone, the user's mobile phone, into the FIDO picture as a removable authenticator. Imagine I'm going to a laptop, I'm trying to log into my bank, and my credentials for my bank is on my phone already. How can I present my phone to the laptop in a phishing-resistant mechanism to log in? That's kind of like part of what we're trying to come to grips with in FIDO CTAP working group right now, or at least FIDO 2 working group on the CTAP protocol. So we've come a long way. We started years ago, 2012, 2013, around there on U2F, the removable second factor use case. And we've been moving on to platform authenticators, providing like re-authentication in passwordless fashion. We'll talk about what that means in a second. But essentially, that's the standard use case that we've all come to know and love ever since the iPhone 5S came out, where a user can now go and you log into an app the first time with a username and a password, and tomorrow you just touch your fingerprint and you're logged in, right? We've all come to accept that as a part of how authentication works in apps. WebAuthn was supposed to bring that to the web. So no longer do you have to have an app on a phone or on a laptop to enable biometric and kind of biometric use cases for login. You can now do this straight from the web, and that's essentially the re-authentication use case that we've enabled with FIDO. We're working on something called discoverable credential support. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Today, FIDO, or initially FIDO, at least the U2F protocol, was invented as a second factor or a second step. We are lately thinking about FIDO as a replacement for passwords. Some would say that was the original intent of FIDO. When kind of like Google started to get involved, second factor was kind of like the main thing we wanted to try and address. However, lately we all agree passwords, are long gone. We don't want them anymore, or we'd like them to be long gone. I guess they're not quite long gone yet. But the idea would be that we can replace usernames and passwords completely with FIDO, and that's where this thing called discoverable credential support comes in. Essentially, your security key or your authenticator will remember all of your credentials. It'll know that you have 5 credentials with Facebook and 2 credentials with Google and 3 credentials with Bank of America, for example, and that you can present those almost like a password manager at will when you want to sign in. So no longer do you have to remember those things. The authenticator will remember it on your behalf. And then, of course, what we'll talk about a little bit later is, what does it take to do full password replacement with FIDO? We're not quite there yet. We think we're on the right track. We're on that journey. But what does it take to really say users will never be entering a password ever again for a specific site? What other ancillary services and things do we have to deliver to make that happen? So I'll gloss over some of these things because I want to be cognizant of time and want to give some a little bit of a gap for questions afterwards. But first there was U2F, right? Use case is very simple. Type in a username, type in a password, and plug in your security key, right? We all understand this one. Benefit here was simply, this is a phishing-resistant second factor. So if there is a bad guy somewhere in the middle here that redirected you to a phishing site, they will not be able to get your credentials because you're logging in with a FIDO security key. And that's the use case that we've seen being deployed. That's also the one that Bob spoke about. Google deploys this use case for internal users as well as for externals. This is kind of like the standard quintessential FIDO second factor. Then the one I spoke about a little bit earlier is the re-authentication workflow, very similar to what you will find in an any modern app that needs authentication today, like think banking app, credit card app. The only difference is, of course, this works on the web. So this isn't true password replacement, right? Because yes, we can replace the password once you've already bootstrapped. So the first time you come to this website, the first time you come to the app, you're always going to be falling back to your username and password, right? After you've done that, then we can set you up for biometric authentication. But remember, if you ever delete the app and reinstall it, or if you move to a new phone, you're right back at square one. You're right back at needing that password again. And that's essentially what we want to get rid of. Even that bootstrap case, we don't want users to ever have to fall back to passwords. Great convenience use case, this one, but not so much on the security angle, because a user can always at will cancel out of the biometric prompt and say, nope, rather type my password, and the system would be perfectly fine and happy to accept that. And that's basically what I said here, right? Every time you get to a new device, you have to enter it again, and that kind of was a challenge. Now, to try and solve these things, in my mind, there's kind of like three major problems that need solving with FIDO today. The first one is, what happens when you move from an old phone to a new phone? If you've created a FIDO credential in the app or on the website, on your phone, everything's cool. Tomorrow you get a new phone. What happens to those FIDO credentials? Like, do you need to fall back to username and password for all of the services again? Clearly, that's a very bad user experience, and it's also not really that secure, and it also didn't get us, any closer to getting rid of passwords. Second problem is, how do I access these credentials from a different device? I have all my credentials on my phone. I am on my laptop. I want to sign in there. How do I get my laptop to talk to my phone in a secure FIDO-like manner where, phishing can't be perpetrated? So that's the second thing. And then the third one, which is a little bit more kind of like in the weeds, the third problem that we're struggling with is one of UX. And that is, if I have a FIDO credential on my phone, or I have a FIDO credential on my machine, and I go to a login page, right? And the login page today says type your username and your password. How would that login page know that it should rather offer me FIDO login? Is it going to have a button that says login with FIDO, or click here for like username and password? What if that website also does sign in with Google and Facebook and others? Do you end up with this smorgasbord of like 20 buttons on the page that the user has to kind of like figure out? So a bit of a UX problem, and we'll try and tackle that a little bit later in the presentation as well. So first off, what happens if you kind of like, lost your phone or changed phones? The latest thinking on this matter is kind of like something like the following. Eliza is going to be our actor here throughout the rest of the deck, kind of looking at different types of use cases. And we're thinking maybe there is something as simple as a FIDO credential syncing available on your mobile phone. This obviously would be offered by either your platform. In this case, it would be Android or Google. Might be offered by like, if you're on a Microsoft platform, this might be offered by Microsoft. On an Apple platform, might be offered by Apple. We can even think in the future that this could be pluggable. If you would like to use LastPass or like your favorite password manager, maybe that can even be offered in as well. That's kind of like the thinking that we have right now, is saying something needs to kind of like take ownership of the FIDO credentials on this device. Early on, there was thinking in FIDO that credentials will only ever be bound to hardware in one single device. But clearly, if we ever want this to be resilient against like device loss or against like users upgrading devices, we need to somehow let go of that a little bit. So the latest thinking is, we probably need some kind of a mechanism for users to back up these credentials from one device to the next. Of course, there is the million-dollar question of how do you allow the user back into this account that is the seed of all backups. That's kind of more of like a platform issue, which we can tackle in Q&A or maybe later in the panel today. But the thinking today is, let's offer some kind of a mechanism for users to move these credentials around. Without this, FIDO just can't succeed, because you'll always have to fall back to something else whenever this device loss scenario happens. Think of it similar as like I lose my wallet, which has 10 credit cards in there. Every time I do that, I have to call 10 different banks and 10 different institutions. With this mechanism, if you lose your kind of like your credentials, you only have to go back to one single owner. So you just need to get a new wallet, and at that point, all your credit cards automatically get restored. And that's kind of like the mechanism that we're thinking about here. We might ask for additional information at that point in time. We don't want to ask for passwords when you sign into this new account. So what about using things like the phone screen lock, right? So we could know, for example, if you're, I think like Apple already does some of this stuff with iCloud Keychain. If you have a screen lock on your old phone, which is highly recommended nowadays, maybe knowing that screen lock on the new phone that you just bought is an additional factor to get you back into that account that gives you access to all of your keys. There's obviously a lot more nuance here, but the thinking fundamentally is FIDO keys at some level will need some way of backing up for resilience, and we're really thinking hard, like as a platform provider, of how to provide that to users. The second problem that we're struggling with is what if a user has credentials on their phone and they need to access these from a laptop or a desktop in a secure way? So the thinking here is, imagine like we have a website that has a button that says FIDO sign in, so the user would click it. Today the thinking is maybe the user would use their phone and open some kind of like a link on the phone. Here you see this little FIDO login button down here. It's not very visible, but it's right there in the right-hand corner of the phone. Click that. Scan some kind of a QR code. COVID has helped us with one thing, and that is getting users more familiar with QR codes. So these things aren't as like frowned upon as they once were. Users are kind of getting comfortable with them. So maybe you go to an app on the phone, maybe you just open the default camera, you scan something, and at that point in time, a secure link is established between the phone and the laptop. It's important that that link also has some semblance of proximity. If it's just all through the internet, essentially it gets back to being phishable. Someone can trick you into linking their phone with your computer. So Bluetooth is actually very, very important here. There's a Bluetooth ping being sent between the phone and the laptop to ensure that they're proximate. That's kind of like the crux of whatever we're doing with FIDO, is always that proximity level. At that point in time, browser sends a notification, sends it directly to the phone. Bluetooth ping succeeds, so we know the phone and the laptop is close, and the user can simply touch their fingerprint on their phone to authenticate the login. So that's kind of like what we're thinking about for phone to other type device login. There's a protocol that we've been working on for a little while there. The protocol is called Cable, Cloud-Assisted Bluetooth. So it's kind of like not the cable. But the idea is that that protocol is something that we'll be bringing to FIDO as part of CTAP in the future to become a standard transport that anyone can develop against. Like it'll work between iPhone and, you know, I don't know, Xboxes, right? The idea is that every platform implements this protocol natively, and then when you need, or when an authentication event triggers, you can use this protocol to get data sent from one device to the next. And of course, once you click on the fingerprint icon, you just signed in on the phone. How do you do this? Well, it's very, very easy. If you look at the actual call that you need to make in WebAuthn, all you really need to do is you need to say, hey, get me a credential, right? You fill in the challenge, you can fill in the RPID. You need to set user verification. That's a specific a construct in WebAuthn. You can set that to required, or you can actually even set that to preferred if you'd like. Basically, that means I need possession of a device, but I also need the user to authenticate on that device at the point in time when authentication happens. So that's what triggered that fingerprint scan on the specific phone. So the idea with this is kind of like more to show it's really easy. It's not like 100 lines of code here. It's really easy to actually, get these types of common use cases going in WebAuthn. Remember, we just did authentication and we assumed there's already like a credential on Eliza's phone. Quick question, like how did we get, or just a comment on like how did that credential get there in the first place? Well, the cool thing with FIDO is if you're on the phone, whether you're using the TriBank app or whether you're using the website as we're seeing here, on day one, the user would obviously go and try to log into the account, like maybe they have a password manager that already autofills these details for them. So user types in username, user types in password, or autofills it in. At that point in time, a little promo appears on the device, and that's obviously controlled by the developer themselves, and they say, hey, next time you log in, don't you just want to touch your fingerprint? This is something that we're used to. Like with common apps today, this happens on phones all the time, mainly in apps, not that much on the web, although, as I mentioned earlier, we have a couple of implementations of this on the web. I believe eBay and PayPal has probably the most well-known implementations of this on the web. But at that point in time, once you say, yes, I want to register my fingerprint, that actually in the background creates a FIDO credential. This is a little bit more involved than the get portion. Here we're creating a FIDO credential on the device, and we usually do this after we've asked the user if it's okay to associate their think about it as biometric. It's kind of the way we're positioning it, but think about allowing the user to log in with something other than their password. This creates the FIDO credential on the device, and now we've established a FIDO credential. Now the credential is accessible on the device, but it's also accessible cross-device using that cable protocol that I spoke about a little bit earlier. And then the last issue that we're struggling with here is once I've done all of this stuff, once I have the FIDO credential on the phone, once we can do all this cross-device stuff, the challenge that still remains is how does a website know that they should be offering a user something other than usernames and passwords? Today, 100% of the population uses usernames and passwords, or maybe a little bit less because there exists some passwordless mechanisms using like things other than FIDO, maybe push authentication or whatever. But the pitch is, in a future world, obviously over time, more and more users will hopefully start establishing FIDO credentials. And how do we help websites and website developers and app developers actually offer users a sane login experience? One option, and the one that I've shown earlier in the deck here, is what about putting a button on the page that just says login with FIDO? When we start talking to developers, they're very hesitant to do something like this, because remember, on day one, if that button ends up on a page, imagine that button goes to the Google login page, right? You have your username field, and we put just a button under that that says login with FIDO. Common experience would tell us a whole bunch of users are just going to click it, right? For no good reason. They're just going to see it there and they're going to click it. Users who should be clicking it will probably not be clicking it, because they'd be like, I'm so used to typing my username, I'll just do this. So clearly, just putting a button on a page isn't good enough. Maybe in the future, maybe 10 years from now, however many years, if FIDO is super successful and everyone uses it, maybe at that point having a sole button that says login, maybe not even just with FIDO, just login, will trigger this and everything will be fine. But in the state that we're in right now, we have this problem of like onboarding users. And what can we do to facilitate a better experience? We've solicited feedback, and developers have come to us and said, well, what about you give us an API that we can silently probe whether there's a credential for my website on the machine? All that stuff, like, not really great for privacy. Like, so we don't want websites to be able to silently, figure out whether credentials exist. There's just, whole set of issues with that, especially with the way the web is working right now, or the way the web is evolving. So the thinking was, what if the browser could intermediate on the user's behalf? Basically, so before I get to that, let me just show you this one. I mean, this is kind of like what we end up, right? If you add another button, in some pages, I probably know from the font which website this is, but it's a very well-known website with a lot of different buttons. Imagine, adding a fourth. This is kind of like the thing that we don't want. So we were thinking, and we said, well, what if the browser could intervene on the user's behalf, just as password managers in browsers do today? And if a FIDO credential is in existence on the device, what if the browser could offer it up to the user in an almost magical sense? The browser is already linked to a paired phone as well. Remember the QR code scanning thing we did? Like, that linked the phone and the browser together, or the system. So what if, when we click into the username field, instead of just showing you your passwords that you can autofill, also just showing you your FIDO credentials? It's very simple, right? We already have the mechanism for that. Pops up, tells you about all the credentials available locally. It might even tell you about all the credentials available on your paired devices close by. So if you have a phone in your pocket, 3-5 feet from the device, that'll also pop up here in the list. User just clicks it. At that point in time, the pop-up on the phone happens and you authenticate. So that's kind of like the thinking that we're working with right now. Websites have a choice now. They can either do the autofill thing, which will be done for them almost by default if they choose to opt into it. There's a little trick that you have to do, which we'll talk about. Or they can still do the button if they want, but they have the option right now to kind of go either or. And I think mostly, at least during the initial phases, we'll see websites probably more going for the left-hand option here, which is just a simpler experience for the user and not as jarring as just adding 3-4 more buttons. I mean, at some point the button might become relevant, or especially for sites, maybe we'll see developers from next year onwards who develop a website which never deals with usernames and passwords, and from day one you're into FIDO. I mean, that could happen. At that point the button makes total sense. But for legacy websites, of which all of them exist today, that's probably the mechanism that we'll see. So how would this work? Well, first you have to check whether the browser supports the scheme. We call it mediation, or like mediated credential management. So the idea is that FIDO mediation would be tested. At that point, as an autocomplete attribute, you'd be adding this username WebAuthn field, and then you'll be making a WebAuthn call just like you always do, but you set mediation to conditional, which basically means the browser would now be autofilling these credentials for the user into that field that you've specified if credentials were to exist. If there's also password credentials on the device, those would be added. So you'd see like a blended list of all your password and all your WebAuthn credentials with some kind of conflict management or conflict resolution. If you have a credential for a FIDO credential and a password credential for the same user, you'd probably only want to show one, probably the FIDO credential and not both. But that's kind of like up to the individual platforms to do that. Or you can simply put a button on the page and just make a WebAuthn call with UV set to either preferred or required, and that'll be that. So that's the conditional field. You literally just do a get call. You add that mediation conditional after you've annotated your username field. And at that point in time, this magically works. So very, very simple UX, not too tricky, hopefully, for folks to kind of get their heads around. So in summary, FIDO is ready for deployment today, but it doesn't enable the full lifecycle experiences yet that I spoke about. We have those 3 things that we're working on right now in the technical working group. This is also supposed to serve as a bit of a a teaser for folks interested in becoming involved in the FIDO technical working group. Those are the types of things we're discussing there. So if you're interested, feel free to talk to the FIDO folks and come on board and come join us there. These are the types of things we're working on and discussing there right now, trying to address these gaps. We have a couple of links on here if you're interested in kind of reading a little bit further. Shane made a great how to FIDO website. There is a document that we've been working on. Actually, a new version is around the corner that covers some of the mediation and other stuff I spoke about, so stay tuned for that. I believe we'll be discussing that in the plenary this week as well. And then lastly, if you want to play with some code labs that we've got out there, feel free to go to that particular website and play around. With this, I believe we have exactly 45 seconds for maybe one question.
4 minutes. So you can
3
take
or
a few
4 minutes.
questions
We can
if anyone has
squeeze
any. Yeah.
20 questions in there. All right. Anything from anyone?
Anyone? I have a couple questions in the app.
Cool.
It's about syncing. Do you want to talk a little bit?
Sure.
Are you worried that syncing might open up a threat vector? Adversaries taking advantage of user credentials syncing between browsers, malware, browser extensions, cookies.
Yeah, great question. We're absolutely worried about it, but when looking at syncing or not syncing, and then looking at the issues that it enables, we fundamentally don't believe that FIDO has a chance at survival out there if we don't have some mechanism for syncing. I mean, that's the base kind of answer I can give here. Without some kind of synchronization or backup, we just can't, this story won't be complete. Users will never be able to get off passwords because every single site will still have to have some robust recovery mechanism, which essentially then just means that instead of having one place that an attacker can go, which is particularly maybe the Google account or the Apple account backup, they now have 30 places where they can go because they can try and break into the Bank of America recovery system directly, or the Chase recovery system directly, or the Facebook recovery system directly. What we're trying to say is Google and Apple and Microsoft and other companies around spend a lot of time and money on trying to harden our defenses for account recovery and getting back into accounts and this whole mechanism. How can we allow that to be leveraged by other organizations? I mean, that was the premise behind signing with Google and signing with Facebook and signing with these things, is saying that, why can't other companies leverage the investment that a company like Google or Apple or whoever has already made in, signing infrastructure? The problem with that was the privacy side of that was always a little bit funky, right? Users weren't that comfortable with it, and it's like, well, what if I ever, move out of the Google ecosystem? Everything is tied to my login with Google. Kind of doesn't feel that great. FIDO solved that problem where it still allows that leverage. So everyone can leverage off the account recovery investments that Google have made, but on the other side, you're portable. If you ever want to port outside of the Google ecosystem, there's going to be a way to do that. If you want to port from Google to whatever the next big thing is going to be, sure, you can port. All of that is available because FIDO credentials are more portable. Another reason for enabling that backup so users can move from one place to the other.
Awesome, thank you. One last question. It's really great to hear about everything that's in development, cable. What can we do today?
That's a great question. So both of the use cases we looked at the start of the deck is available in full, kind of full deployment, right? FIDO security keys, totally there. Anyone can deploy that, and Bob gave us some great examples of where that is being successful. Of course, we've also deployed them at Google. The other place where we can deploy is also the UX enhancement, right, on websites. A user is logging in. Today they type username and password every time they go into login. Tomorrow they can type username and password, then you sign them up for biometrics, and then they can just log in using the biometric. And at the same time, if you enable those workflows, you're actually already creating FIDO credentials on those devices, which will hopefully, when these other technologies like cable comes along, will be accessible to users to start using. So you won't start from zero again. All of these credentials that you've made will actually be accessible in these newer ecosystems as well. So there's a lot of things. I'm happy to talk offline about this as well. But there's quite a few things that FIDO can enable today already where there's value.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry we're out of time for questions. Let's thank Christian for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christian.